everyone, Brad Evans here from Sounders FC, and welcome to United Way of King County's Emerging Leaders Advocacy Panel. Before we begin the event, I wanted to thank you all for attending and showing your interest and commitment to civic engagement. I was excited to see this offering as part of Advocacy Day in the United Way's Days of Caring lineup, giving us ways to volunteer, give back, and work toward a more equitable community. This is a critical year for us as a nation, and our actions and decisions over the next couple of months will set the tone for several years ahead of us. Census, voting, advocacy, racial equality, these are all urgent and important issues that we need your support to show our community's strength. In regards to the census, once in a decade, the census counts our populations and households, providing the basis for reapportioning congressional seats, redistributing and distributing federal funds. Each year, more than $675 billion is distributed based on these census numbers. These dollars impact everything from housing to education and healthcare. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's really clear how important it is that we are all counted. We have until September 30th to complete the census, so I hope you'll take the census today and spread the word, especially in underrepresented communities. In regards to voting, in addition to taking the census, we need to continue to make our voice heard by voting. We know how close some elections have been in the past. There is no doubt that voting matters extremely important. You'll hear from other young professionals like you on what they're doing to get the vote out. So let's make sure we're all doing our best that we can and head to the polls to make sure your voice is heard and you have a say in the issues that are really important to you. In regards to advocacy and convener, at Sounders FC, we know how important it is for our club and our players to use our position in the community as both convener and advocates. As advocates, we're dedicated to using our platform for good and relaying important messages to those who otherwise wouldn't receive or pay attention to create any sort of change. As conveners, we help bring together organizations, groups, and individuals who want to move the needle like we do. Just like what we're doing tonight with all of you at United Way. We encourage you and our community to vote, not just in this upcoming election, but every damn time. So let's kick off an evening of education, inspiration, and building momentum around voting and advocacy. Thank you guys for having me. Have an awesome night. I wish we could do it in person. Go Sounders, get out and vote. We love our community, so let's do the best that we can for it.
Wonderful. Quick second to thank Brad and the Sounders. Super inspirational note. And after that, I'd love to introduce our first speaker for tonight. She is part of United Way of King County's public policy team. She's the resident expert on all things public policy. And so I'd like to introduce to you the Associate Director of Planning and Public Policy, Colleen Lane.
Thanks so much, Natalie. Of course, my air purifier just kicked on high, so hopefully there's not like a roar in the background. It's just the way these things always go, right? I'm excited to be talking with folks tonight about voting, but first I'll just take a sec to let you know how United Way engages in advocacy. So we lobby at the state, federal, and local levels for policies and issues that are aligned with the areas where we invest donor dollars, ending homelessness, reducing poverty, early learning, and high school graduation. When I say that we lobby, what I mean is that we talk to elected officials, we ask our supporters to email and tweet at elected officials, and we participate in coalitions of other advocacy organizations to strategize about getting legislation passed and budgets that will support the work we do. So let's talk about voting. There's a lot on this year's ballot. The headliner, of course, is the presidential election. I'm sure everybody's well aware of that. Members of Congress will be on the ballot and the Washington State Legislature. And Aiko, we'll get to this one a little later, but thank you. That will be our first slide that we want to come up in a few minutes. So we'll also have some state executive offices on the ballot this year, the governor, attorney general, secretary of state, and others. And the state Supreme Court and Court of Appeals judge positions will be on the ballot. So a lot of important races will be decided. we'll have some local items on the ballot, but mostly not candidates. So they usually get elected in odd years for city council, county council. But we will have ballot measures, some to do with taxes and others to do with changing how our government works. So when you first open your ballot, you're going to see a statewide referendum about whether schools should be required to teach comprehensive sex ed, which is not the case right now. Next, you're going to see a section called advisory votes, and it will actually have a header that says advisory votes. Now, there's a lot of important things on our ballot, but this is not them. These advisory votes can be complicated and confusing, and they don't necessarily have any action that gets taken from them. So I feel like they cause voter fatigue, and you might never make it to the candidates to do your voting. So there's no harm if you skip this section and come back to it at the end if you feel like it. Because the most important things, we want to make sure you get to them. All King County residents are going to be asked to vote on several charter amendments. These are like constitutional amendments for the county government. And that comes right after the advisory vote section. So be sure not to skip that charter amendment section. There's one in particular I want to call your attention to. Charter Amendment 6 will allow the King County Council to re-envision policing by changing what the sheriff's office does. This is in line with a lot of the criminal legal reforms that are being called for by Black Lives Matter and Zero Youth Detention, et cetera. So it's critical to have your voice heard on this issue. And after my section, I'll post a link to County Council member Zahilai, who has a great video in a tweet about that if you want to know more. If you live in Seattle, you'll be voting on whether to continue an existing 1/10 of a cent sales tax that pays for expanded metro service and for subsidized ORCA cards. If that tax fails, then those existing dollars will go away and those services will be cut back. After all of those ballot measures, then you'll get to the part where you can vote for the candidates. So it's a long ballot. There'll be 2 pages. And if you want to know what will be exactly on your ballot, you can Google King County My Voter Info, and you fill out a little form and it will show you, like if you live in Seattle, this is what will be on your ballot. If you live in Federal Way, these are the things that will be on your ballot. So how do you decide how you want to vote? I am a big fan of Washington's mail-in voting system because it gives you time to really look at the ballot and think about it either before you fill it out or while you're filling it out. Sometimes if you're going into a polling place and you've got a long list of candidates and issues, it can be pretty stressful trying to remember exactly what you were thinking when you were making up your mind. When I vote, I have a few things handy in addition to my ballot and of course my dark pen. I also like to have the voter's guide, which is mailed with the ballot and has pictures of all the candidates and their own personal statement about why they're running, what their priorities are. It also has pro and con statements about ballot measures. Then newspaper editorials are another great resource, like the Stranger or the Seattle Times. They make endorsements based on questionnaires and on interviews, and then they publish an article. And for a race that has 2 candidates, for example, they'll profile both of them and compare and contrast them on various issues. And you can learn a lot about a candidate based on that. One thing to be mindful of is how your personal politics align with any given editorial board. So you might read the Seattle Times and say, oh, I'm a little bit to the left or I'm a little bit to the right of where they usually land in their editorials. And you just keep that in mind as you read their analyses. Another great source of endorsements is advocacy groups. It could be World Wildlife Fund or ACLU, Black Lives Matter, your church. There's a million issue-oriented groups out there, and if you feel strongly about a particular issue, you can look at which candidates they endorse and how they end up, get rated based on the criteria from those groups. The place in the ballot where I personally always struggle is with judicial races because I'm not an attorney and judicial candidates aren't usually well known and they don't usually get covered in the paper. So I like to Google various bar associations to see how judicial candidates are rated. And in addition to big bar associations like the Washington Bar and the King County Bar Association, there are special interest bar associations that are really great to look at, like the Lauren Miller Bar Association for Black attorneys, or the Latino Bar Association, Washington Women's Lawyers, GLBT Bar. You don't have to remember their name. You can just, while you're filling out the ballot, Google like Black Bar Association Washington, and you'll find it. And then once you're on their website, you can search for the candidate ratings. So once you've figured out how you want to vote, we want to make sure your vote gets counted. You've probably seen articles about delays with the post office and speculation about how that might impact people's ballots being tallied. And there are mixed messages on whether this is going to be a significant issue or not. But if you have taken the time to vote, then we want to make sure your vote gets counted, and counted early enough to get reported on election night. So I would advise sending your ballot in 1 week before election day if you're going to mail it. That's about a week after you receive it. If you want to circumvent the post office altogether, then you can drop your ballot in the King County Elections Dropbox. And that is the slide that we were sharing a few minutes ago. This is a map from the primary election. So these boxes, there could be a couple added or a couple moved, and in middle of October, they'll have a final location for each of these drop boxes for the general election. So if you click on any one of these icons, you'll get the exact address of where that box is located. And what I recommend doing is jotting down that address and going to check it out. My Dropbox, for example, is in a mall or outside of the mall. And I happened to see it before the primary, so I know, okay, it's right in front of Party City. But, you know, it's no fun in November with sideways rain and it's dark at 4 o'clock and you're wandering around looking for a Dropbox. You really want to know ahead of time where that is. And you can actually drop your ballot off before Election Day if you want to assure that you aren't going to be waiting in line there to drop your ballot. So we'll give you a link in a few minutes to that website so you can check it closer to election time. But let's talk about registering to vote. All US citizens 18 and older on election day are eligible to vote unless they've been disqualified by a court. You have to register though in order to get your ballot in the mail, and the easiest way to do that is online. So we're going to share a link to the Secretary of State's office, and to register online, that's the, there we go, the top, there's 3 bullets with links, and the top one is the one you click on to register. So you can note that, or you can just search Washington State voter registration and you'll get that linked. You'll need a Washington State driver's license or state ID in order to register online. Otherwise, you can register by mail, and you'll find that same information about how to get mail-in voter registration at that site. The Ballot Dropbox is the next site, and it's a long one, so you can just Google King County Ballot Dropbox map. That's how I found it. The bottom link is just to the general King County elections site for all sorts of questions or contact information. Now, ballots will be mailed on October 14th. So if you know that you're registered to vote and you haven't received your ballot by about the 19th, you want to think about whether you've moved in the meantime. And then contact the elections office, which is that, that 3rd bullet, King County Elections, and check in with them. You can also do that after you're, you voted if you're worried for some reason that your ballot hasn't been counted. So not all groups vote at the same rate. Like with most things in life, people who have the easiest access participate at higher rates. So if your parents have voted and you've voted before and you understand the system really well, then you're more likely to vote. But language and cultural barriers tend to suppress voting rates. So the King County Elections does a lot to try and promote voting in underrepresented communities. They gave out about $900,000 in grants to community nonprofits that work with people to promote voting in non-English speaking communities and communities of color. And they also translate ballots and voters guides into 4 languages other than English, but we all know that there are a lot more languages than that spoken in King County. And you know, they make a good effort, but there are still disparities in voter turnout. So back to voter registration. If you are not registered yet, now is the time. The election day is November 3rd, and you can actually register in person up to and including election day, but don't wait. It's much easier to register online and to vote by mail. So now is the time. You can also, you can register online to vote by mail up until October 26th, and that is the same deadline for changing your address. Just one last thing, if you live in Seattle, you might have heard about or even received democracy vouchers, and you might have wondered what is up with that. Early in the year, when there are city council races, so that would be this coming January, the city distributes 4 democracy vouchers worth $25 each to each Seattle voter. And voters can assign those to a candidate, and the candidates then use those just like any other campaign donation. So it's a kind of groundbreaking effort by the city to adopt public financing in elections in order to balance the influence of special interests. So rather than have businesses that would be regulated by elected officials do most of the financing of campaigns, which you can understand is a conflict of interest, this balances that out by adding public dollars and a lot more people, individual voters, into the mix of who's influential. All right, that's what I've got for you. I hope it's helpful, and get out there and vote.
Thank you so much, Colleen. That was a really informative presentation. I know I picked up a lot of really great information. Had no idea what a democracy voucher was before today. So definitely thankful for that information. If you have any questions for Colleen, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll definitely read those out loud. So any questions out there? I'm sure you're all typing furiously. Acting now, like Colleen said. Okay. Well, there's definitely going to be time for more questions for Colleen after the panel, so you've not lost your opportunity. But do post any other questions that you may have for Colleen if you feel so inspired. We'll definitely be sure to bring her back after the discussion to address some of those questions. With that being said, I'm very happy to transition to our fabulous panel moderator with the great background. So I'd like to introduce you to our amazing moderator, Abel Pacheco Jr. Abel is actually an Emerging Leaders 365 donor like me, and he's been involved with the program and with United Way for many years. He recently served as a Seattle City Council member for District 4 and is currently the Government and Community Relations Manager at Sound Transit. So Abel, before you introduce the panelists, I'd love to hear a bit about what attracted you to United Way of King County and what keeps you coming back to give and work with this organization year over year.
So when I think about just a lot of the programs that impacted and benefited my family after they immigrated to the U.S. or after my mom divorced my father, and just some of the programs that helped contribute to raising me, more often than not, I would see the United Way logo and many other community organizations as well. So I keep giving, as well as giving my time, not just financially, but giving my time and many of my efforts to United Way, because I know that those programs make a difference. And so, when I think about the programs and the priorities that United Way has, such as like fighting homelessness, I think about the single mom that, many times that my mom was trying to, was making sure that we had a roof over our head. She used to always say that, her job as a parent was to put a roof over our head and food on the table. So many of the programs that United Way funds were programs that helped my mom. When I think about the programs that help students graduate, I've shared before with folks that, I was a kid that was didn't always do the best in school. I was suspended and nearly expelled more times than I can count. And so it doesn't feel like long ago, but many of the programs and the opportunities that I know that I wish I would have had, and as well as many of my friends who wish they would have been able to benefit from as well. And then lastly, when I think about just what's important for breaking the cycle of poverty, as I shared, many of the struggles that we had that come from very humble beginnings. So a program like Fuel Your Future, ensuring that kids have food in their stomach as they go to learn, are important for their success. And so, and when you think about the COVID Community Relief Fund right now, I think a lot of programs like that are important in terms of helping those frontline workers or families who are most impacted by COVID. And so I've taken the approach of my year 2020 being too blessed to be stressed. And so any way that I can help share that and as well encourage others to share both, I definitely want to do that as well. So that's why I've been engaged with United Way. It's why I continue to be engaged with United Way. It's why I will probably forever be engaged with United Way, because I'm indebted to so many of the programs that United Way and the core mission and principles of United Way. So that said, I want to transition to giving our panel an introduction. We have an amazing panel tonight. So I want to get started with Connor. We'll work our way backwards. Connor, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks, Abel. I'm Connor Walsh, and like Abel, I'm an emerging leader 365. So being a part of that affinity group, that giving community, means that I just care about the work that United Way of King County does. And full transparency, I also work for United Way of King County, but I also am happy being a donor as well, and think, kind of like what Abel mentioned, that there's so much work that United Way does in the community. I want to be a part not only of giving back at work, but using the dollars that I receive to give back to the community.
Thanks, Connor. And our next panelist is Alexander.
Hey everybody, I'm Alexander Russian. I'm with YP Communities Young Professionals. I'm actually a transplant to Seattle. I moved here just a few years ago, but I've been politically active for most of my adult life, and I really enjoy working alongside United Way. I think there's a lot of significant positive changes that can be made if we all just stay civically engaged.
Fantastic. And our next panelist is Rachel. Rachel?
I think you're on mute, Rachel. The dreaded double mute. It is just the story of my life this year. I'm Rachel Peterson. I am on the Seattle Chamber's Young Professional Network board. I have been involved in public policy, advocacy work for about a decade. I'm currently at the Boeing Company. Prior to that, I worked for Senator Patty Murray, who is the senior senator from Washington State, and have worked on a number of campaigns. So incredibly passionate about advocacy, educating yourself about public policy, and being a part of this process.
Boy, those are great introductions. So I want to follow up those introductions with just the basic question of tonight. Why is it important to vote? Connor, if we want to get started with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when I think about why voting matters, I kind of spend a lot of time going back and forth, thinking through, kind of what these good arguments might be. And it kind of boiled down to two things for me, the head and the heart. And when I think about kind of maybe the head argument for it, I think about how much elected officials influence your daily lives. So when you think about things like roads, schools, police training, tax legislation, budgeting, climate change policy, homelessness work, anything really that you can think about, you are affected by that every single day. So it's really difficult, frankly, not to be impacted in some way daily by the decisions of elected officials. And the great thing about voting is it's one of the few and rare opportunities where we collectively can come together and choose and make sure our voice is heard, who we want to represent us and our loved ones. And the second piece that I mentioned is thinking about the hard approach. And when I thought about the hard approach, I thought of this idea about how voting always is this deeply personal venture. And, I think that that's really true, but it's important to maybe reframe that a little bit and think of voting a little bit differently. So voting still is deeply personal to me, but I feel the strongest urgency around voting when I think about others, when I think about, my loved ones, when I think about my community, when I think about the community at large. That's why I vote. That's why voting matters to me, because I think about what today looks like and what the future might look like. So, I still care obviously about myself, but this is something that's really a lot bigger than me. And I care about using my voice to make sure that the future for my loved ones and for my community is a better place. So, just one last piece, when I think about voter apathy, I think the best way to combat that is empathy, right? If we can just be more caring and think about, our loved ones and think about our community, that's a really strong argument for why you should be voting.
Thanks, Connor, and thank you for highlighting how important and how many of those important decisions are made on a local level. Alex, same question.
Awesome. So I largely agree with everything that Connor just said. I'd like to especially harp on the fact that, so for instance, myself, I began becoming politically active after I served in the military. And up until that point in my life, my opinion on politics was, if I don't bother it, it won't bother me. And as I've gotten older and more engaged, I realized how untrue that is, right? There is a certain section of our population that is privileged enough that politics doesn't affect your life. Either the effects are benign or beneficial. But for most people, politics are very integral to our day-to-day life. Just like Connor said before, if you drive on roads or pay taxes or follow laws, politics are happening to you whether you get engaged or not. And voting is the number one way that we display our voice. What I often tell a lot of people who are in my circle who say, why should I vote? I'm one person out of 350 million. My vote doesn't matter anyway. I always tell them, when you don't vote, what you're saying is that your opinion doesn't matter. These politicians are going to make laws that affect you whether you vote or not, and you need to let them know what you want your country to be like. And to the extreme is even when you don't vote, it's almost like you're agreeing with the person you disagree with most in politics. So I always say, get your voice heard, let them know what changes you want to be made, and that's why I think voting is important.
One, thank you for your service, and as I'm reminded of a former president who once used to say, "Don't boo, vote." So, thank you. So our next question, and we'll start with you again, Alex. What does being civically engaged mean to you? And as a follow-up to that, why is being civically engaged important, especially for young people? And I think you touched on this a bit in your earlier response.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a natural outgrowth from voting. There are a lot of people who consider themselves civically engaged, politically active, but the only time you see them is every 4 years for the headliner, right? The presidential election. But politics is not a once in a 4-year event. It's something that's consistently happening. We have congressional elections, local elections, state elections that happen on a rolling basis all the time. And the time to be interested is not election day. It's important to make sure that you are constantly aware of the things that are happening around you, to the people that you love, to the communities that you care about. To me, being civically engaged really just means knowing what's happening, paying attention to the changes that are occurring and why they're occurring and who's affected by them. A lot of my civic engagement really boils down to get out and meet people, talk to them, ask them what's important to you. What things about your community, about your city, about your state don't you like? How would you like them to change? Well, let's find out. Let's do some research and see, are there people out there who represent your views? And if there are, you should be putting in the work to get them elected and voted into public office so that they can enact the changes that will support the things that you want to see happening. So that's why I think civic engagement is super important. There are a lot of people who show up, vote for the president every 4 years, and then wonder why things aren't going their way. But it's a continual process of working together to create a better country for ourselves.
All great points, Alex. Rachel, same question. What does it mean to be civically engaged, and why is civically engaged important, especially for young people, young professionals?
I think especially it's important for young people, regardless of how you view it, because if you think about it, the demographic that votes in the largest numbers are actually the baby boomers, the generation that is now retiring, which means that people who are moving out of the workforce and moving into a different and very important but different stage in their life are making decisions for us. And they're people who grew up when the world looked drastically different. I mean, they didn't grow up with the internet. They didn't grow up with technology. They didn't grow up with, I mean, they certainly grew up with climate change. They didn't know it then. They weren't talking about it like we are. And so they're making decisions for us that are not going to impact them in the way that they think it will. Because they aren't us. They don't have the same lived experience. And it is not a knock on folks who are not young professionals or who are not young. It's just that the lived experience is really different. And so I think that being involved, I mean, this is our world. This is the world that we have inherited and we get to be engaged with. And that is an awesome opportunity and a responsibility to be involved. I think for me, civic engagement means staying up with the news, what's happening. It means recognizing that you will never in any way, shape, or form know it all or fully understand what everything is happening from a policy perspective, but staying cursory involved, having conversations with people, being willing to sort of dig in and learn about what civic engagement is. Host a fundraiser. If you find an elected official that you think is really great, host a fundraiser. It's really easy, especially right now with Zoom. It's so easy. And you know, bring your friends. It's $50. You find interesting articles, share them. Staying informed is one of the most important things, and it can be really hard to do because I know all of us are just exhausted. I mean, we are living in the world of information overload, but it is incredibly important to remain engaged in those spaces because it impacts every aspect of our lives.
Great points. I always often say that politics is a bit of a relay race, and I think it's up on our generation to pick up that baton and keep going with it and make it the world that we want to make. So, Connor, our next question, how do you motivate people in your networks to vote?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to harken back a little bit to what Alex and Rachel mentioned, just to kind of really hit it home. For a lot of us on this call, we've got like 50, maybe 60 years still living on this planet. So that's a long, long time. So, decisions made right now will affect us in 50 and 60 years and generations upon generations to come. So, a little bit sidetracking there, but definitely want to hit that home. Maybe you're only 30 right now, but when you're 80, things will be a lot different. And the decisions made today will certainly affect that. But to get back to your question, Abel, I think, one thing that I would think about is just don't shut up, right? Don't shut up about voting. Just keep talking about it. Keep making sure that this is on the forefront of conversations. I know that once I get my ballot, I'm going to be bothering all of my friends all of the time. I see somebody wrote in their electoral college votes, and I think of electoral buddies, right? Find a buddy that might not vote and bother them, right? Keep talking to them. And I think the other thing to think about as well is to maybe take a step back at the same time. Maybe you have friends that haven't really been engaged and often don't vote. I think that's a great opportunity to have a real conversation with them, right? On a one-on-one basis, you can really uncover a lot of the reasons why maybe they don't vote or maybe they don't care about voting. And as what was mentioned before, I think a good starting point for something like that is maybe to move away from talking about national politics, which is something that always dominates every single conversation, every headline, and talk about what's happening locally, right? As what Colleen mentioned before, there are a lot of decisions that we're making on our ballot, and all of those decisions will still be affecting us. So if you can figure out a way to have these good conversations with folks and maybe shift the narrative away from something that's so contentious, and this year it certainly is the presidential election that's incredibly contentious for folks. I think that's a good opportunity to talk to folks and perhaps convince them to engage and vote this year, and think about how that vote will impact their future. The last thing that I'll mention, and this has been brought up a couple times as well, is we can't overlook the fact that voting rates really do vary greatly based on race, right? So if you're working with specific communities where you see that there are disproportionately lower rates of voter turnout, those are great opportunities to talk to folks and make sure that they're electorally engaged, right? Talk to them about maybe why voting matters to you, maybe why voting matters, for your community, because that's a really important way to make sure that this representative democracy is not just representing the voices of white folks, it's also representing the voices of all votes, right? So I guess that's all I'll say about that. But last thing is just don't stop talking about voting. Voting is really important, and just keep bothering people about voting.
I like that, a voter buddy. I'll make sure to identify one myself and make sure that they vote. Rachel, how do you motivate people in your networks to vote?
Honestly, it's a lot about the voter buddy, actually. I've got a group of friends, and we are I will candidly admit I'm a huge public policy nerd. All I want to do is talk about public policy and politics, and I don't know how to have a conversation about anything else. So my network knows that if they spend time with me, all they're going to hear me talk about is that and the importance of voting. I've got a bunch of friends. It's a couple. They have this tradition. They've had it ever since they started dating in college, so 12 years ago, where they do ballots and brunch, and they invite people to come with them and do ballots and brunch. And this year they did Zoom ballots and brunch, and they had a whole big party where everybody just did their ballots together, talked about what was on it, talked about some of the issues that they didn't quite understand. And it's great. It's such a great way to get involved. I think, to Connor's point, I think people are really afraid to have these conversations because they feel like voting equals politics and politics equals arguing. And I think the reminder that I always try to tell folks, and I have, obviously I work for Patty Murray, so I'm a diehard Democrat, but I have plenty of friends who are Republicans, and I will hound them to vote just as much because it is an honor that we get to do. It's something we get to do that many, many people in this world do not get to do. And I try to remind folks that. I used to work in Middle East foreign policy, documenting human rights abuses. I'm like, I'll never not vote after that, and I will candidly get on people's cases sometimes. I mean, I think it's just reminding people that yes, it doesn't feel like it always matters. I get that, and it's frustrating when you vote and you care about something really passionately and it doesn't happen. Like, that is soul crushing. But at the same time, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu, right? Like, if you're not participating in the system, then who knows what's going to happen to your wants and needs and interests. So it's incredibly important to show up, to be there, and make it fun. Do ballots and beer, or ballots and wine that doesn't, have the same alliteration, but find a way to make it exciting and fun for your network, because it's exciting. Voting is fun.
I definitely want to host a ballot and brunch after this. So thanks for another good idea. So our next question, we'll start with Connor. What's a myth or fact about voting and advocacy that you can share?
Yeah, I think probably a good myth that I think always is perpetuated is that voting doesn't matter, right? And I'll go in one direction here. There are a number of races, tons upon tons of races that were decided by just one vote. And if you take that even further, there are so many races that are decided by tiny, tiny fractions of votes. So, when you think about how voting doesn't matter, I think turning it on its head is really important, because your vote matters so much in these tiny, tight little races. And I just think folks think that there's always this larger margin between races, but when you get to these really close fractional races, and sometimes it's even decided by one vote. I know that there was a race decided where someone, it was a tie, and they had to pull a name out of a hat. I mean, think of the 5 or 10 folks that just were like, oh, I just decided not to vote today. just didn't do it, and they probably had a strong preference for maybe one candidate over the other. So I would always vote like the margins are very thin and ensure that your voice is counted.
It reminds me of the 2000 presidential election in Florida, where it was decided by 537 votes. So, Rachel, same question. What's a myth or fact about voting and advocacy that you can share?
Okay, I have 3, but I'll be quick. So the first one is that, well, everybody in my state is going to vote a certain way, so I don't need to. I think 2016 clearly speaks to that. Polls don't hold and carry the same weight that they once did. There are many people who just don't feel comfortable responding to polls on both sides of the aisle. So 2016 just throws that out the window. I mean, even here in Washington state, where we generally on a federal level are pretty Democratic, if you are a Democrat, you should not assume that all of your neighbors are going to carry water for you. You should show up and be a part of that. Number 2, advocacy is not lobbying. I think a lot of people get confused and think, well, if I advocate on behalf of public this policy, or if I send a letter to my elected official, am I now a lobbyist? What's that threshold? You have to spend 30% of your time advocating on behalf of a specific piece of legislation to be considered lobbying. So none of this is lobbying. And third, your elected officials do want to hear from you. I know that oftentimes if you've sent a letter to them, you get a form letter back. You used to write those form letters, but I promise you, the elected official gave the policy position. They really, really want to hear from you. When they don't hear from you, that's almost worse than when they do. Like, I remember being in the senator's office, and we were, we were handling a specific public policy issue, and we were getting a lot of folks in opposition to something that we didn't think we necessarily would have in the first place. It was really important to hear that. We also had the reverse, where we thought we were doing something that the district or that the state would be really supportive of, and we heard cricket. So I think there's this assumption that, if I weigh in, it doesn't matter, or I'm only going to weigh in when I'm angry about something. Weigh in when you support something too. I can tell you our elected officials could really use some thank you, because they don't get a lot of those. And it's important to let folks know how you feel. So don't assume your neighbors are going to carry water for you. Advocacy is not lobbying, and your elected officials want to hear from you, I promise you.
As a former elected official, I would tell you that is 100% true. So I want to loop back into Alex and ask him the same question as well. What's a myth or fact about voting and advocacy that you can share?
Yeah, I think one thing that comes to mind for me is somebody who's lived in a lot of different states across the country. You often hear, my vote won't count because I know which way my state's going to go, right? I'm from New York originally, historically a blue state. I moved to Seattle from Atlanta, where Georgia is normally a red state. But as you can see, even now Atlanta is turning purple, not Atlanta, but Georgia is turning purple and becoming more of a blue state. And part of the advocacy is that your count counts for more than just one, right? I don't wake up in the morning on election day, go to the ballot box, cast my vote, go back home, and then that's it. I'm talking about politics with my friends, with my family, with my network. I let them know I am voting for X legislation or Y person because I want these things to change. And that may engage them. It may give them some resolve to also get involved with the process. When they hear me say, I am voting on this day for this person because I want something in my state to change, they'll say, I also want that change. So I'm also going to go vote. And then they're telling their friends and their family and their circle about that. And so there's a lot of people who say, I'm in California and I'm a Republican. Why would I bother voting? And this actually goes back to something that Rachel says too. Despite whatever my personal political leanings are, I encourage everyone I know to vote, right? I don't want you to vote the way that I vote. I just want you to vote. I want your voice to be heard. I want our representatives to represent us, even if that means I don't particularly agree with them all the time. And so I think that's one of the biggest myths, is that when you are politically active and civically engaged in casting a vote, your vote really it can have an outsized impact on the people around you and the outcomes that eventually come from that engagement.
Great point, and I appreciate the shout out to Georgia. I mean, part of the reason that it's going purple potentially is because people are showing up to vote. And so, we'll see how that continues in the future and see how that changes. So our last question, I want to open this up to all the speakers. What are some of the ways and activities your organizations offer to help people stay engaged with advocacy both before and beyond the election? So I will start with, Alex, let's start with you again.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I mentioned earlier, a lot of my civic engagement comes from just a networking aspect. I just like to meet people, hear what they're about, hear about their lives and what they want, and then just kind of talk it through. Say, what are the things that you hope will change, right? Or what are the things you like or dislike about the current state of things in our city, in our state, in our country, and find out if they are, I don't want to say, let's say, if they are informed. Right? I think the act of being civically engaged requires you to do some research on your own. It asks you to become involved, to put in the effort to learn what people's stances are, what politicians are pushing for, what the history of a particular issue is, so you understand what the trajectory is. And just in the involvement of talking to people and getting to know them, you can find and become more civically engaged with people that agree with you and even with people that don't agree with you. Some of my favorite political conversations with people I don't agree with, right? Trying to get to the root cause of why do we see things differently? Why do you think the thing that I think would be the worst outcome is what you want? I don't get it, right? And we talk it through, have a beer, chill at the bar, and kind of come to a conclusion on that. And a lot of what YP Community is about making those connections, especially among young professionals in the Seattle or Pacific Northwest area, just finding ways for us to come together and talk about the things that matter to us and build some of those connections that let us have the tough conversations and really pressure test the conclusions we've come to, either through nature or nurture.
Great point. Connor, same question.
Yeah, absolutely. So with United Way of King County, one thing that we're always focusing on is we want to make sure that we're providing opportunities for folks to learn about what's going on in the community. So if you're not familiar with the work that United Way does, we kind of focus on 3 bucket areas, right? So our homelessness work, our work around breaking the cycle of poverty, and our education work. So we're always trying to provide opportunities for folks to go in and listen in from folks that are experts, like Colleen, for example, on our public policy agenda, or other folks that we work with and other nonprofit leaders that we bring in who can kind of highlight and kind of like what Alex mentioned, talk about historically what we're seeing and what the current issues are around those 3 pieces. So that's one important way for folks to stay up to date with what's going on in the community and learn a little bit about not just what United Way is doing, but what our nonprofit partners are doing, what perhaps our business partners are doing, government, and beyond. So that's one way. So we have speaker series, and if you sign up to be an Emerging Leaders 365, you'll receive lots of opportunities for speaker series. We'll do networking events similarly, where we want to make sure that we're providing an opportunity for folks to learn about the community and stay connected to community. I want to highlight a couple other things briefly. Colleen Lang leads our public policy newsletter. So that's a great way for you to stay involved and learn about what United Way of King County cares about and what's going on in the King County community. And the other couple pieces are, we have a census volunteer opportunity that's coming up. So like what was mentioned earlier, with redistricting coming up in 2021, it's very, very, very important that we fill out the census. I'm not sure if this is still up to date, but right now I think we have the 2nd highest rate of completing the census. I think it's just behind Wisconsin. So if you haven't filled out the census yet, please do, and perhaps think about volunteering to really push out census outreach so that we can beat Wisconsin and make sure that every single person living in Washington state is counted and pull down all of those federal dollars that we deserve to go back into our communities to make sure it's a better place. And if you're always looking for other ways to get involved, just go to uwkc.org. We have a ton of information about our work and opportunities to look at upcoming events and upcoming ways to stay involved and engaged.
Great points, Connor. And after the election, obviously you'll have new representatives potentially, and so I know Colleen does a great job, her and Nick, in advocating down in Olympia for some policy changes. and they do a day of action as well in January or February, but I'm sure Colleen can clarify for me as we get to the end. Rachel, same question. What are some ways and activities that organizations that offer to help people stay engaged with advocacy both before and beyond the election?
Yeah, so the Young Professionals Network is a part of the Seattle Chamber, and the Seattle Chamber's mission is business advocacy for organizations and members that help thrive in this equitable and inclusive regional economy. So what they are looking at is public policies that help our communities grow and expand in an equitable and inclusive way. So we provide information on local issues to chamber members at free monthly business issue forums. We've also got updates on issues at all levels on our chamber website, which is a great resource. We also have an easy to use letter writing tool for certain issues as well. So it means that you can do some easy advocacy work. There's a public policy issue that the chamber's got on their website. You just type in your name, your email address, and your zip code, and you press send, and it goes off to the elected official in question. A good way to find out more about that is on the Twitter account, which I will post, and then I will also share the YPN event, YPN website as well. We do have a lot of really interesting events. We do some great meet and greets with public officials as well, local and state and federal. So it's a great way to stay informed.
Thanks, Rachel. And wanted to invite folks who are in our virtual audience, if they had any questions they wanted to submit. Let me check the chat box. Oh boy, there's a lot of messages in the chat box. Okay, hold on, give me 1 second. I'm gonna try to get myself following up. Let's see. Colleen, thank you for clarifying and listing a number of organizations. Let's see. Okay, how do you hold elected officials accountable to issues they campaigned on? That's a great question. Rachel, given your experience with Senator Murray, do you want to take that one? Yeah,
well, first and foremost, you vote. I mean, here's the nice thing, right? Like, they work for you, and if you end up not agreeing with the way that they operate when they're in office, and they said they were going to do X and they do Y, you vote, and you vote them out. You also weigh in. You send a letter. You make the case for why that issue is not being addressed. And you find other organizations that are doing the same thing. And there is, of course, strength in numbers. Coalition building is one of the greatest tools that we as advocates have, all of us, and I mean us, we, the citizens, finding organizations that also feel strongly the way that we do and giving to those organizations and sort of pooling the resources is a great way to make sure that our elected officials are held accountable.
Thank you. I'm going to, just because of the number of questions that are here, I'm going to try to limit it and spread the love around. Alex, I'm going to take the next question. What are your thoughts about gerrymandering? Let's just leave it there. What are your thoughts about gerrymandering? And if not as much here in Washington State as in Southern states, to the extent that one person, one vote needs to be a platform issue?
I despise gerrymandering. I want to make that clear right off the top. I do not like it. I think it's terrible that we have allowed this to happen in our country. And as the question alludes, what the net result of gerrymandering is that people's votes do not carry as much weight as they should. And that is a simple and pure disenfranchisement of people of their constitutional rights. It's removing from people the ability to choose who represents them at the state, federal, and local levels. Well, mostly, some levels more than others, but it's bad no matter where it happens. I am very much against it, and I do everything that I can in my power to advocate against gerrymandering, do what we can to fix it. I know that redistricting is coming up after the census, and so that's one of the things that I talk about in my circle as well pretty often. But yeah, I don't have much to add to that question other than I don't like it. And I do think it's an issue that is of high importance and one that needs to be settled, right? Because it'll be very difficult for us as a people to vote for the issues we care about when our votes are not being weighed equally. So gerrymandering is one of the things we have to fix first so we can tackle more and more of the other issues and make sure that we're all being represented and our voices are being heard.
And I know there's great points, and I know there's a lot of national efforts to try to do something about the issues of gerrymandering. The next question comes from Cara, and I'm going to direct this one to Colleen because it references the U.S. Post Office. How do you help get the correct information out in time for the election?
That's a great question, and very timely, because I know that in one state at least, the state's court had to bar the post office from sending those postcards that are referred to in the question. So, you know, when you vote for judges, then you're determining who's going to make those decisions in cases where political you know, decisions are thrown into the courts. And we know we've had a presidential election thrown into the courts with Bush Gore. We've had this issue with, you know, who gets to vote, who gets notified about registering to vote, thrown into the courts. So the courts often decide these things, and you get to vote for Supreme Court and appeals court judges in Washington. So that's one great way. But then joining good government organizations. So the Municipal League of King County, League of Women Voters, there are a lot of good government organizations. And we're lucky to live in a state that was, you know, became a state during a kind of electoral reform period in history, and has a lot of protections built into our Constitution. But that's not the case for every state in this country. So oftentimes the most effective thing you can do is get involved in things that are going on in other states. So David Domkey is a professor at the University of Washington, does a lot of work with people from the King County area, helping them get involved in issues around voter access in other states that are kind of pivotal in the election. So there are resources, there are good government organizations, and just, you know, do the research, get on the Google, see what you can find, what resonates with you.
Thanks, Colleen. And this next question, I'm going to ask this to all the panelists, including our host and Colleen. I'm going to include you as well, so I'm going to go one by one. What local issues are you most pumped about in this election? And there are several. Colleen, do you want to start, kick us off?
Sure. Well, I did work it into my presentation, and that is Charter Amendment 6 for the King County Council. I feel very passionately about police reform and criminal legal system reform overall. I think this is an issue where people are making their voice heard on the streets, and it's time for us to fix the institutional barriers to change. And this is one very direct and concrete way. Let's give the county council the ability to take some functions out of the county police department, which is the sheriff's office, and put those into more social service things. You know, cops always say they don't want to be social service providers. So we can fix that. We can take those functions out of their domain and put them into other offices, public health or human services.
Great points, Colleen. And just so that folks are kind of for fully aware, sheriffs and the Seattle Police Department are overseen by two different councils. There's the King County Council, and then there's the Seattle City Council. And so the two law enforcement agencies are overseen by different councils. And there's also Charter Amendment 4 and 5. They're closely tied to both the King County Sheriff's Office, and they're not as they're not in the forefront as Charter 6. So be sure to read about 4 and 5 as well. Connor, what issue are you most pumped about this election?
Yeah, I think it's really hard not to be excited about Charter Amendment 6. Like what Colleen mentioned, it's a great opportunity for us to take all of the energy that has been out in the streets and look for real change. And I think to take that a step further, when I think about filling out my ballot this year, what I'm interested in looking for is I want to vote for issues and for candidates that want to take the energy and look at historical injustices and want to do something about it. So I'll certainly be doing my research before I make any decisions on that, but that's certainly something that's at the forefront of my mind.
Thanks, Connor. Natalie? Oh, you're on mute. I think you got the double mute, the dreaded double mute.
The double mute. The way I shall die via Zoom. I am interested in the same. You know, I think I'd be remiss to ignore the national election. I think that whatever party you support, I think one of the most disappointing aspects of the last presidential election was the low voter turnout, particularly in communities of color. I think that if you're impacted and you're speaking your truth on the streets, you should show up at the ballot box and do the same. Rachel has just given me my favorite line ever, which is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. I am going to put that in my back pocket, host a ballot brunch, and share it with everyone I know. Because I think it's true. I think that if you care, you have to take some type of you have to reach some level of civic engagement. And so I'm very, very excited about all of that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And ballots and brunches are going to be a thing that's going to be, what are there, 40, 50 attendees, 46 attendees. So I think there's going to be 46 ballot and brunches in the month of October. Rachel, you had an impact tonight. So Rachel, you're next. What local issue are you most pumped about this November?
So I'm just really excited that we're all getting excited about charter amendments. Like this is my dream. I am incredibly pumped on Charter Amendment 7. So this is in King County, and this prohibits discrimination on the basis of family caregiving, military or veteran status. So currently, King County Charter prohibits discrimination in county employment or county contracting. My earbuds are falling out. Based on sex, race, national origin, religious affiliation, disability, many, many things. But does not include family caregiver, military or veteran status, which I think is a huge oversight. Interesting statistic, Washington State has the highest percentage of service members who, when they are stationed here and leave the service while being stationed in Washington State, remain in Washington State. So the fact that we don't already have that demographic included kind of blows my mind. And the family caregiver one, really, I mean, that is such a huge issue. I mean, you've got folks who, and of course my mind goes to military caregivers. I did a bunch of work on that when I worked for the senator, but you've got folks who are working as a caregiver for a family member, and if they're discriminated against based on that to me just is unacceptable. So I think that Charter Amendment number 7 is another really important one to look at.
Thanks, Rachel. And next up is Alex. Alex, what are you most pumped about this November?
So like I mentioned earlier, I'm a city boy. I'm from New York City. I have some very choice words about the public transportation in Seattle. And so I'm a very big advocate for the expansion of public transportation in Seattle. I know we have a couple of bills in the House right now that are all about expanding our rail line, our bus line. I just think the knock-on impacts of having a poor public transportation system can be seen, especially in a city as affluent as Seattle is in Washington, right? For people who don't work in big tech companies or things like that, it can be very difficult to live close to where you work. And adding in that transit time or the amount of money it takes to live close to where you work really just makes your life exponentially harder and impacts the people who need the break the most, if I'm going to put it bluntly. And so I am very excited to watch some of these initiatives go through, to expand our rail line, our metro system, get our public transportation a little bit closer to something that a world-class city should be. I mean, we have enough people that we should have more than 10 train stops. I'm just saying.
Well, working for Sound Transit, we're still on schedule to open the 3 light rail, the Northgate opening in September 2021. The SBTD renewal that you mentioned this November, that's a local ballot initiative, and that will help, I think, riders most impacted currently who are still on our system. While I feel too blessed to be stressed and lucky to be able to work remote, we have a lot of folks who are still frontline workers who do catch public transit, and so any efforts that we can do to renew that SBTD will be tremendously impactful for them as well. Let's see, our next question, let's see, boy, if I zoom out for a second, I end up getting 5 or 6 messages in here. I love it. Do you have any advice on how to effectively have conversations about politics with family and friends while living in a polarized time. Alex, you're on my screen. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier too, but politics can be a sensitive subject depending on how deeply engaged people are and how polarized they are in general and how deeply they feel passionate about a subject. I normally, especially if this is someone where I'm building my relationship with them, we don't have a good rapport yet, I'm not sure where they're at and how they react to things, I always start with the issues, right? And this probably comes from my training as an engineer too, but you start with the data. There are a lot of political conversations that start with your candidate sucks, and you're not gonna get a good conversation that way. It's much better to start by saying, listen, I don't like the way our city does X. I really wish we would do it this other way, and I think doing it that way would benefit these people, who might include myself, who might include you in these ways, right? And then you have the conversation that starts there. Maybe their view is, no, I don't think I want my tax dollars going to what you just mentioned because, and then they give their reasons. And it begins something of a more personable relationship where you can go back and forth on your personal opinions and how you feel and figure out where your values align and where they differ, rather than personal attacks against other people, be they politicians or the one you're talking to. So I always start by talking about the issues and what the effects that I would like to see are, and working my way backward from there. And so far I've found that that's been a much more effective way of starting and maintaining those political conversations, especially with people that you may not know so well.
Great advice, Alex. You know what? I want to open that up actually to everyone, because I'm sure everyone has a bit of a personal story or experience to kind of how they've guided either an uncle, a parent, a grandparent through an issue, or a close friend. So maybe there's an opportunity for us to share a bit of knowledge amongst each other of how to best navigate that conversation. So Connor, you want to go next? I think you have a double mute. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I know, right? Every time. Actually, I've gotten lucky so far. I probably jinxed myself now. So maybe you shouldn't call on me again. But I feel like, for me, I feel like anytime I'm talking to anyone, it's always political, right? It's almost hard not to have a conversation outside of just, and you know, I was going to give it, you know, an idea, oh, the sky is blue, right? But, you know, I think every single conversation really ends up boiling down to a political conversation, right? So if you just acknowledge that, that's a good way to start thinking about, like, all right, you know, things might move in this direction, and I should be aware of the fact that this is going to be a conversation about political views. So with that being said, kind of like what Alex mentioned, I just listen, right? I just listen and, you know, take everything that Alex said, and then also think about choosing your battles, right? When we have a finite amount of energy and time and, you know, choose really when you want to kind of go down that path with someone. And think about, you know, are they trying to engage in an actual debate or conversation with you, or are they just more interested in riling you up, right? So if you think about those three things, or I don't know how many things I listed, but if you think about those things when you're having that conversation with someone, hopefully that doesn't make the conversation devolve into a screaming match or a moment when someone just leaves, right? They just walk away. But really, I guess I would just stress listening and trying to do your best to think about how they're coming at this, which, you know, maybe going back to what I mentioned before is trying to think about that empathy piece and trying to think about how they're coming to this conclusion, or perhaps to this thought process on it.
I will vouch for Connor, because I think when we first met, if you recall, he started talking to me about politics. we had just met.
Oh, that's right, at Geek Choir Bash.
Yeah, yep. I remember.
And then we talked about democracy vouchers, which are important, very important.
Yeah, I'm pretty good at remembering people where I meet people. Not necessarily always the first name, but I can tell you where I met you. Natalie, next.
Yeah, absolutely. So interestingly enough, my first political experience was at 2016. So graduated with a degree in political science. I'll preface that my interest in this is deep and nerdy. And I was always amazed by the ecosystem within a political party even. You know, I think in the US we're so focused on two major parties, but even within each party, there's a huge difference between who sits on the far left of the party and who sits on the far right. And the things that tie you together apply across the board, regardless of whatever party that you believe, you know, speaks to your truth, the truth that your family lives in, or your friends live in, or your colleagues live in. I think one of the most interesting conversations I ever had was actually with a gentleman who, you know, he recently passed away, and I'm forgetting his name, but I met him at college, and he was part of the civil rights movement. And this idea that you had people fighting for your right to vote, and that wasn't so long ago that we should forget that, you know, people, you know, bled and were beat and fought for this right to civically engage, and now we kind of, you know, turn our noses up at it sometimes, and it's a strange thing to see. So I like to have those conversations with people. I tend to not even ask the party you affiliate yourself with, if you consider yourself conservative or liberal, more so, hey, did you know that 50 years ago you probably wouldn't have been allowed to vote? You know, if you go even further back, women weren't allowed to vote, and so why shouldn't we exercise the right to express those things that we believe in and vote for those causes that we care about? So.
If you have time to vote for American Idol, you have time to vote. Rachel? I might have dated myself by that one.
No, definitely not. What do I think? I mean, a lot of the points have been covered. I think that it's really important to recognize lived experience. So my boyfriend and I were we just spent a week on the Olympic Peninsula in a camper van, and we went into many establishments with people who had very different opinions about the world than I do. But they have different opinions about the world because they have lived a completely different experience. The people who are growing up living in Clallam Bay, or living near La Push, or living on the Quinault, like that's a different lived experience. And so I am always curious to hear why and how people come to the conclusions that they come to, because I think there's a lot of value in that. My best friend in the entire world is a Republican fundraiser, and I love the conversations I get to have with her because it challenges me to truly think about why I feel the way I do about a particular policy issue. And there's a lot of value in that, because when your opinion is challenged, you grow. You might change your mind, and that's okay. Like that's the whole point of politics, is that, or not politics, but, you know, policy and civic engagement, is that we're not, you know, we're not stationary creatures. We're learning, everything's evolving, and we need to evolve with it as well. And that's a great thing. I also think, you know, to Alex's point, you don't need to start. I think a lot of people assume that when you bring up politics or policy that you're looking for a fight. And so I think if you bring it up with more of a, hey, I saw that this happened, I'm really curious what you think, I'm still sort of forming an opinion, or I'm still figuring out what I think about it, you open a door for a dialogue, and people don't immediately feel attacked. I think that there is, I think particularly, I'm born and raised Seattleite, so I think particularly in Seattle and in sort of the region that we live in, there is this idea that, like, we're really opening and welcoming to everybody unless you disagree with me. And I really want us to think a lot about not being that way, because it's okay to disagree. That's what's really great. But I will also say, and Abel, I know you can talk to this too, when you see two elected officials on TV sparring and you think, man, they must really hate each other, I promise you they probably get dinner after that interview. Like, elected officials do not dislike each other. That some of them do. But to the most part, they have friends across the aisle. They have those relationships. And the same with at the staff level, you know, for the most part, folks who are getting involved in public policy, their heart's in the right place, right? Like, they see a problem and they want to fix it. And so even if you don't disagree with how they're getting there, try to find that common ground of, like, well, what do you think the problem is? Like, why have you come to that conclusion? It doesn't have to be aggressive. It can be really interesting and really fun.
Yeah, I'll just say that being in public office is probably the most physically, emotionally, mentally taxing thing I've probably ever done. So, Santa, thank you if you see your elected official that does do something you actually support or like. It goes a long way. They never hear it. Colleen, same question. If you have an experience to have conversations with family or friends that would be helpful during this polarized time.
It is really a tough time right now to engage with people who disagree. And I gotta say, sometimes white people really suck. You know, there's just a lot of awfulness about some people's opinions, not because of the policies that they're landing on, but because of identity politics. And people have been bought into an idea that somehow they are losing when someone else gains. And that sort of zero-sum mentality, there's a lot of toxicness about our discourse these days. So I have a friend who engages in a lot of conversations with people who I would call trolls. And I'm like, why? You know, you have a limited amount of emotional energy and, you know, can it be spent on something more productive? You know, I have a lot of people who ask me, well, what do you think about this race or that race? And I love talking to people about stuff. I'm a wonk, you know, I like to get into the details of policy and, you know, those are great conversations to have. But I was sharing privately with Kiddist when my cousin, who I barely ever see, who grew up in Chelan and, you know, raised his kids in Idaho, talks about how glad he is that his kids live in Idaho so they don't have to grapple with white privilege. I really struggle with, you know, should I engage him? I mean, I feel like I should, but is it going to make a difference? You know, will I get through it all? You know, how do I engage him? We never talked one-on-one, so then shall I just shame him back on Facebook? You know, I mean, it's really tough. And so I think it's a very personal decision. And, you know, I like to spend my energy where I feel like I can change institutions and structures. And I feel really privileged and fortunate to work at that level in my job. But, you know, I don't want to tilt at windmills, and I'm an introvert, and I don't really, you know, relish these, you know, confrontational engagements. So, you know, it's a very personal call, and it's not an easy call. And I don't feel like I always rise to the challenge the way I would hope I would. So yeah, it's a tough time.